Welcome back, everyone, to the third episode of the Environmental Justice Podcast for the spring 2022 semester. I'm one of your co hosts, Christopher Jean Louis. I'm a sophomore sustainability studies and economics major, joined by my other co host, Nicole.
Hi guys. I'm a junior. I'm studying business analytics and also STS. My concentration within STS is the law concentration.
So, you guys might remember from our last episodes that we were taking a sort of deep dive into choice issues relating to environmental justice and how they relate to the Troy area. While in past episodes we've given a very basic background on contamination or the general history of the Troy area, this episode we're going to be talking about food sovereignty and how it interacts with us on campus and with the greater Troy and capital region. So, at the very forefront of the issue is the topic of food deserts. For those who don't know, food deserts are essentially pockets of land within communities, typically marginalized communities, that lack access to healthy food. So, think a neighborhood with 4 blocks. At the corners of the top left and the top right, you would have maybe a Publix if you're in the South, an Aldi's, or another grocery store with fresh produce, accessible healthy food for low prices that everybody in the neighborhood could afford. But at the bottom half of the neighborhood, you have a string of gas stations and no supermarkets, no farmers markets, no grocery stores with fresh produce or healthy foods. The bottom half of that area would be deemed a food desert. Of course, imagine on a larger scale because the bottom half of that area, those residents don't have access or easy access to the healthier foods that the top half does. So, a food desert is essentially regions of residential areas where residents are either incapable or unlikely to be able to reach healthy foods and consequently have their health jeopardized. So oftentimes, like when I use the example of gas stations, wherever there is food available within a food desert, it's related or causing bad health impacts. Let's say a lot of junk food causing increased tendencies for asthma or diabetes, or high caloric foods causing obesity or other similar health defects that could otherwise be avoided with great accessibility to more traditional, cleaner foods. So, of course, people are changing their language towards the concept of food deserts because a lot of times it's manufactured in a way that sort of dispels narratives that these are just naturally produced. Whereas the dominant narrative is that a food desert just appears or it's dependent on how communities organize themselves. A lot of academic thought is sort of reorienting towards relating that in a systemic context where food desert isn't just natural, it doesn't result from a community, it results from government policies like zoning or business incentives provided by governments to integrate themselves in one community rather than the other. And of course, this lends itself to racial discrimination and systemic bias. Because food deserts are found to be more common within Black and Brown communities, zoning laws, lending practices, business and commerce chambers within cities are often found to isolate and deter businesses, especially groceries and other fresher produce selling stores, from entering and establishing themselves in those neighborhoods through arguments like these people are poor, they can't afford your wares anyways, or these areas are dominated by crime and poverty, and that you have a greater chance of suffering from crime or theft. And these things usually create the conditions for food deserts rather than allowing them to just spawn. So when we talk about food deserts, because of that known systemic history, we sort of translate it to the term food apartheids, because apartheid is a very charged term that directly implicates the government and the wider public who is not part of this community because they both abide by it and actively produce it. So of course, when we think about food deserts, and we acknowledge that they're more prevalent in Black and Brown communities, the immediate assumption is that we're talking about African Americans, but of course, there's always the often overlooked indigenous peoples who suffer from food deserts, but often aren't included in the national conversation or the local conversation because they're so far removed from contemporary politics or our understanding of American society. One of the more close and relatable examples is the Akwesasne, who you might remember we mentioned being within New York, but curiously straddling the New York Canadian border. But of course, I'm sure Nicole can tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. I think one of the I got like not great examples, but I guess just like like it's really unfortunate that like food deserts are a thing for example, like the Akwesasne indigenous groups, due to contaminants that they have like in the water, and I think is it in the water or in the soil? I don't like exactly remember.
Both.
Both, okay.
Because water from streams can seep into groundwater and contaminate soil too.
That's true. So yeah, due to that, because part of their diet it's heavily fish, and due to those contaminants now, like they can't eat the fish because it's very unhealthy for them, and it could be very detrimental to their health. And it essentially like allowed them to have fruit sovereignty, but like due to the contaminants they've been forced to like use other sources and outside of the group, so like they're essentially relying on like these unhealthy foods in their diet, which has now like led to a very serious diabetes issue within this group. And I mean, like there are also like other examples. I mean, we learned this recently, like Troy, New York is also like a food desert because like there just simply isn't any grocery stores in the area. They're all like within like driving distance, with at least 10 minutes away if you live in Troy.
Yeah.
Which is crazy because I thought.
Yeah, RPI students would know. RPI students would know since we always default to Walmart, but that isn't the most accessible to a lot of people. And consolidating all your grocery options into one supermarket isn't always the best for people who live further away, who have trouble getting access to transportation. I do want to define food sovereignty real quick, since we're talking about it in terms of indigenous peoples, because food sovereignty is related to sort of independence. If you guys haven't heard about sovereignty before, it's sort of your ability to decide for yourself. It's very similar to the term self-determination. When we talk about it within indigenous contexts, it's usually related to tribal sovereignty, which is the ability of a tribal government to declare itself sovereign or like independent from American intervention. But where food sovereignty comes in, it's more of a rejection of like dominant structures that force you to like subscribe to one cuisine or subscribe to a single type of processed food. It's essentially the independence to choose what you eat. And so when the Akwesasne had food sovereignty, they were essentially subsisting off the land with their fishing practices, the traditional farming, and they've lost food sovereignty. They lost that choice of how to feed themselves when everything was contaminated and they had to buy pre-made products from pre-existing, let's say, convenience stores rather than actively practicing their traditional values. So that's why we bring up that term.
Yeah, it's like it's very important like for them to have that food sovereignty, especially when it's like in these like specific like cultures and groups. And now like going more so into like how we can apply that in the capital region. I mean, I kind of already brought up that like Troy is a food desert, but there are initiatives that are happening right now in the capital region trying to make that not a thing. And one great example is the food fridge. It's essentially like a national movement, but it's mainly in like it's like in the capital region. Essentially, literally all that it is that they leave a fridge in like certain areas in like I think Albany, and I think there's one in Troy, and they leave like a bunch of food in the fridge and anyone can take whatever they need from that fridge. And they have like volunteers to obviously make sure that the fridge is cleaned periodically, and they connect with like local businesses to ask for donations. And it's actually really nice because I think it allows like a lot of autonomy where like you're not really forcing anybody to like have papers or go through any sort of like legal processes to like get free food. And also just like people can just take however much that they need like without being feeling like judged or like being shamed for like grabbing the food, and people are able to essentially serve themselves. And so it's been successful, and I know they're trying to like expand more of the organization. And I think like again like that's like one way to like help with having like being a food desert. And then another great example, there's actually a group called the Soul Fire Farm, which I think they're in Troy or like outside of Troy. Like I know like they're around like the capital region area, but it's essentially an Afro-Indigenous centered community farm, like committed to like uprooting racism and like seeing sovereignty in the food system. And they basically grow and distribute the food for those in need. And they focus on like including like Afro-Indigenous groups in the growing process to allow marginalized groups to take control of their own food production process. And again, like the big goal is to use and like celebrate traditional forms of growing food. And they hold like a bunch of like different workshops for like urban youth so that like they can learn more about like, you know, like having a garden or like growing their own food, so that people don't have to depend on, you know, going to like a grocery store or like again having to commute to like getting food if they can just like do it from the comfort of their own home. And again, it's like mainly for people who are like in like urban food apartheid environments. And again, like the Soulfire Farm, like their major focus is just like activism in general, and it's a great initiative like what they're doing.
Yeah, and the absence of bureaucracy for the food fridge is especially important because if you apply for like SNAPs or food stamps, it can take months to hear back and receive like your very first package, and in that time, you're sort of just left stranded to get to feed yourself.
Yeah.
So skipping that step and just getting pre-cooked food left out for anyone to take is super helpful. And for Soulfire Farms, the focus on reducing recidivism, which is essentially when people who exit jail or have a brush with the law are either so traumatized or so marred by that experience that they just return to the same behaviors that led them to crime and they just keep re-entering the criminal system. And I mention this because Soulfire Farms has a specific initiative to help urban youth who have had trouble with the law by sort of offering their own community service or rehabilitation program to help them like satisfy their court requirements. It's extremely helpful to sort of reduce the social economic inequities in producing or sending black and brown youth to prisons and in combating sort of like the dominant narrative that these types of people, me being one of them, can't escape this cycle by providing something that's truly revolutionary. So Soulfire Farms, which I think is maybe an hour out from Troy,
Yeah.
They're fairly secluded. They're not in the city, but what they're doing is just remarkable. Thankfully, though, we can't just expect the capital region to pick up all the slack for a nationwide issue. So there's quite a few initiatives going around countrywide for us to discuss, and one of them is the Department of Agriculture's and the federal government's Indigenous Food Sovereignty Initiative. It's essentially a program offered by the Department of Agriculture to promote traditional foodways, to promote the use and practice and learning of Indian country foods and agriculture markets, and promote indigenous health through those foods, but tailor to the dietary needs of American Indians and Alaska Natives who might have suffered from food deserts and have dietary restrictions because of that. Say if you're now diabetic after being exposed from processed food for too long, or are otherwise dietary restricted based on your heritage or your religious beliefs. So the USDA is partnering with tribal serving organizations or tribes themselves to sort of reimagine federal food and agriculture programs from their perspective and inform their future programs and policies so that it accommodates them as well. So within the same department, the Indigenous Food Sovereignty Initiative is also paired with another initiative that allocates around $3.5 million in funding for Native groups who are working independently towards food sovereignty. This includes helping them lobby for legislation that allows them to regulate themselves within the USDA, which is a key part of sovereignty, if you remember, because it allows them the freedom to choose and act without non-Native American intervention. It helps fund their efforts to build seed processing centers so they can find native tribal land fauna and produce and reintroduce it into their ecosystems, since a lot of the times they've been displaced or their ecosystems have been damaged by contamination or urban creep. So it helps them reestablish the sort of plant life foliage that they have a spiritual connection to and allows them to reinforce and practice their spiritual practices through farming and their food. And this project, with the $3.5 million in funding, also serves to help them build animal husbandry experts and projects to transition from more colonial meats and foods like beef and cows to bison, which is much closer to spirituality, especially for the Indians that lived in the plains, the Great Plains in the Midwest. For example, a notable group that is aiding in this effort is the Intertribal Buffalo Council, which is around the upper Midwest, around the same place as the National Bison Range. And that is a collective of different tribes across the country who are trying to bring back bison populations from endangerment. Multiple video series show them using these methods to both build connections with these bison populations and also reinforce the depleting awareness or diminishing practice of cooking styles and recipes within indigenous communities and outside of them.
Yeah, I mean, there's like a bunch of like national movements going on with like initiatives like this, and I mean like even, for example, like grassroots endeavors are like popping up like all around the country. One of them being the Food Project. It's actually based in Boston, Massachusetts. They basically grow produce in the area and they sell the produce in a variety of like the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which like it stands for SNAP. They also build garden beds in food insecure communities. They hold workshops in gardening and cooking. They also hold programs for encouraging leadership in younger people so that they can get more involved in initiatives such as this. And also even local libraries, they sometimes run community gardens for this purpose. Like I know, like at least in New York City, I know that they have things like that. So those are just like some examples. And now like getting into like our last bit with how RPI students can actually help out with these types of initiatives. For example, there's actually an organization called Capital Roots. It's a local organization that people can volunteer with. Their mission statement is essentially that they cultivate and nourish communities by creating equitable access to fresh food and green spaces in support of a robust regional food system. They host a series of programs that seek to give communities food sovereignty. So for example, like again, like community gardens, they have a thing called like the Produce Project, where it's like it's integrated within like high schools, and it teaches like students about agriculture as well as having some networking events and just developing leadership skills in general. And also something called like the Veggie Mobile, which is produce on a mobile truck to go to areas without access to healthy food. And again, it's like very important to like be involved in things like this, because like in urban areas people don't really get as much of like, I guess, an education like in their own like at least in like the public school system. From what I know is that like, you know, since like if you're from like an urban area, like they really don't have programs like this. It's usually, from what I've heard, like people who live in like very rural areas, they'll be taught about like agricultural skills and things like that. And I think it's great like having that integrated within like urban areas so that people can actually learn to like, again, like grow food and like, again, like providing like food sovereignty, especially if you're in an area that has like a food desert. And I'm sure you guys know about this chapter at RPI. I'm very much involved in the Food Recovery Network. So Food Recovery Network is essentially an organization. They have a bunch of different chapters across the country. They basically fight food waste and hunger by recovering perishable food that would otherwise go to waste from like dining halls. And at RPI specifically, we have a chapter like that where we bring leftover food from, like, for example, Father's Commons, Sage Dining Hall, and we take all that food and actually take it to St. Joseph's shelter, which is in Troy, and it's essentially a homeless shelter. And again, it like helps like, you know, like we provide like leftover food for like those people so that they can have like food to eat. And you know, like they have like things such as like they call it recoveries, where you can essentially volunteer to either be a driver or like accompany the driver, take the food in a car, and then like again go to St. Joseph's. And again, they have an e-board. They have like a whole like you can get very much involved like in within their leadership. But even if you just want to do recoveries, like I really recommend it because it does not take a lot of time. Like it takes at most like 30 minutes to like get the food, then go to St. Joseph's. Like I just think it's a really nice thing to do, and I think it's really important. Like, you know, if you guys like just like want to look into the Food Recovery Network to actually like be aware of it, and if you want to get involved, like again, like I encourage both.
Yeah, especially after the spring 2021 quarantines that we all went through.
Yeah.
Where the entire campus was in uproar about the amount of food that RPI was wasting. I'm sure that's on everyone's mind when we bring up food sovereignty. So I really encourage you guys to check out the Food Recovery Network or anything around the Kappa region. You can donate, you can volunteer. There are multiple opportunities on our website with each of these organizations that we talk in this podcast. It's ultimately up to you how involved you want to be in reestablishing these key choices and freedoms for marginalized communities around us, around RPI. Other than that, we don't have much more to say. That's it for this episode. Hope you enjoyed this little insight to food sovereignty. Feel free to check out our website for more resources or to revisit some of the topics we've discussed. But other than that, we'll catch you on the flip side.
Thank you guys.